We are delighted to have our next speaker, the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Miss Elizabeth Allen. She comes with us with incredible experience, over 15 years of strategic communications and public affairs experience. Secretary Allen specializes in message strategy, project and crisis management, and leadership communications. And she previously served as a partner at Finsbury Glover Hearing. She served as Vice President Kamala Harris's Communications Director for the Biden-Harris 2020 campaign. And under the Obama-Biden administration for 7 years was a Deputy Communications Director and Deputy Assistant to the President, White House Director of Message and Planning, and the Deputy Director of Communications to then Vice President Joe Biden. She serves as the Director of Public Affairs for Educational and Cultural Affairs. She served at the U.S. Department of State and worked with the State Department to address human trafficking, international women's issues. We are so delighted to have you. Thank you for making the journey. And please join me in welcoming our Undersecretary Elizabeth Allen.
Good morning. Happy day 3 to our media participants who I know have been here for a few days, and welcome to the East West Center alumni. I want to thank the East West Center for having me. It is a real pleasure to be here. We do a lot of work with the East West Center at the Department of State. It is a place where relationships and ideas flourish, and it is an honor to be here. I am so glad to make the trip. With this illustrious gathering and the conversations that you all are having this week, it's critically important, in my view, for the U.S. government to show up, talk about our perspective and what we're doing, and I'm really excited to be here today. It's also an honor, of course, to be preceded by so many incredible thinkers and practitioners, including Maria Ressa, who I know you all heard from on Tuesday. And while many of you may know her as a Nobel laureate, we at the State Department also know her as an alumna of our Fulbright program, which is our preeminent academic exchange program for people around the world. She, of course, is an extraordinarily courageous champion of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of digital future, freedom of our digital future, and that's the digital future that's free and open that we want to build together. I also just want to note, as a very generous introduction noted, I've worked in communications in and out of government for my whole career. And as a point of personal privilege, it has been an honor to work alongside journalists for that career. And I am deeply, deeply respectful of the work you do and the role you play in democratic societies. And so that deep respect and understanding that we all have a role to play in upholding democratic principles is the context with which I come to this conversation today. The President Biden, of course, has noted that the future of each of our nations, and indeed the world, depends on a free and open Indo-Pacific, enduring and flourishing in the days ahead. And that indeed is what underpins our U.S. government approach to the Indo-Pacific region and our foreign policy there. Indeed, the United States is committed to deepening our relationships in the Indo-Pacific and supporting a region that is secure, connected, prosperous, and resilient. And I think of those 4 attributes, the connected part is the part that we're going to talk about here today. It is sometimes the most under-discussed as we all think about our security and economic equities in the Indo-Pacific. But frankly, it's the connections between people and communities that are necessary to build enduring strength, openness, and freedom. And so in order to build that strength, openness, and freedom, we are taking a hard look at the existing and emerging challenges throughout the region. That has led us to commit to investing in democratic institutions and the rule of law, the protection and promotion of human rights, a free press, and a vibrant civil society. It has led us to our commitment to expose corruption and drive reforms in this space, and a commitment to advancing common approaches to promoting the development, deployment, and governance of critical and emerging technologies such that their adoption improves people's lives and strengthens rather than weakens democratic and civic institutions and fosters rather than degrades truth, which I know is what you all have been talking about here this week. We are quite clear-eyed about the threats posed by those who envision a future in which media freedom is constrained, that freedom of expression is criminalized, the flow of information is stymied, and that civic institutions should be hollowed out rather than bolstered. And we know that we cannot and should not face these threats and solve these problems alone. It's exactly the fact that we have to tackle these challenges together that I'm so grateful to be here today and value the opportunity to have a dialogue about it. The challenges we are now facing in the information environment are complex and dynamic enough that there are very few perfect answers, which you all know to be true. But we are better off for this opportunity to exchange ideas, increase understanding of each other, and build solutions together. So just a bit on the problem, which again, we know well, but it's important to think for you all to know how we're thinking about this as very much a 360 problem from the US government standpoint. We know we're here to talk about restoring trust in a zero trust world. And I am certain that over the last 2 days, you've had rich conversations about many of the problems that weigh against trust. But I'm gonna challenge the premise, and proudly so. I'd like to say, I don't believe we are operating in a zero trust world. Quite the opposite. I think people still want to trust. I think actually, in fact, we are seeing people desperately trying to seek the truth. And it's actually that it's much harder to find it and to know who to trust than it is that people don't want to be able to trust. They want to actively seek out places and sources of information that they deem accurate and trustworthy. And that's very much where we think our role as a US government comes in, using our credible voice to spread truth and lifting up other voices across the world to do the same. Every day, my team, which includes about 1,500 people in DC, and very proudly 4,000 public diplomacy foreign service officers and locally employed staff at US embassies around the world, some of whom are here today, they work to foster a more truthful world. We are deeply proud of the work. We take it very responsibly. We know that trust must be earned and that hard truths must be addressed with honesty. As Secretary of State Tony Blinken, our boss, says, quote, "If the United States is not engaged, if we are not trying to lead, then one of two things is happening. Either someone else or no one else, and that's usually is leading, and that usually leaves a vacuum that's filled by bad things before it's filled by good things." So, we at the Department of State are actively monitoring the escalating assault on trust in our institutions, on truth, and as well as the real and dangerous implications for society, civility, and livelihood. And of course, as we know, among the most pressing threats to trust are the efforts of adversaries to manufacture and spread disinformation. In the Indo-Pacific region, in addition to mis and disinformation flowing in from private citizens in other countries, including, unfortunately, the United States, we are obviously all confronted by the PRC actively working to constrict, suppress, and contort the free flow of information, a topic I know that's come up all week. What we now call the information space has always been a theater of competition. But today, however, as you all well know, technology has enabled actors with malign intent to both precisely target individuals and spread disinformation on a global scale. So we have to think about how to combat both. While technology offers a platform for the previously voiceless to be heard and a place for like-minded people to find each other across borders, of course a good thing, we also know it's misused by authoritarian regimes to extend their repression as they seek to silence voices that might speak truths they don't want heard. And those committed to sharing the truth, including researchers and journalists like many of you, are under some of the most acute pressure, both online and offline, and we are tracking it closely. We know that according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, not only were 293 journalists behind bars for doing their jobs by the end of 2021, but we've obviously seen an uptick in legislation that criminalizes press and free expression, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. So that's the problem. And I want to talk a little bit today about what we're doing about it at the State Department and on behalf of the US government. And the first thing I want to talk about is the government's responsibility to tell the truth. At the State Department, we are committed to telling the truth about the world as we see it, the world that we see evidence for, the things that we witness. It's why we laid out the pretext of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's why we have called on the PRC to end the Uyghur genocide. We know that we have to communicate with honesty, with credibility, and with clarity to strengthen our partnerships and to build engagement worldwide in every corner of societies. Our fierce defense of the free press, of transparent elections, and of the protection of civil liberties, like the fundamental freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly, are at the core of our values, home and abroad. These are the bedrocks of democracy and at the heart of a vibrant, trustworthy information environment. And I have to say, as a democracy in constant evolution ourselves, we are clear-eyed about our own shortcomings. We remain committed to being open and honest about those shortcomings, about where we are and where we're looking to go. We're committed to communicating truthfully, even when the truth is hard to face. So one of the most powerful things we can do as a State Department and as a US government, as a matter of the democratic principles that underpin our foreign policy, and is exactly what our adversaries will not do, is tell the truth. Tell difficult truths. And being able to speak truthfully, and more important, to be heard and believed, all depends on being able to engage people and build trusting relationships. And that's where a lot of our public diplomacy work comes in. As was mentioned, I'm the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy. People often ask, what is that? Quite simply, it is engaging people around the world. It's the work of engaging communities, of building relationships, all to make sure that we are progressing forward as societies around the world. So the work of our public diplomacy really comes in when it comes to building trust. Building people-to-people connections through a variety of programs and platforms is one of the best ways to build trust amongst individuals, organizations, and governments. Those connections that are essential to forging meaningful interactions in a crowded and contested information space. You all know this. People trust their dentist, their weatherman, and their neighbor more than they trust a lot of other people in the information space. So we have to make sure that communities of people and neighborhoods of people are talking to each other and feel empowered to speak truth to power. Today, more than ever, we need to make sure that these people-to-people connections feel urgent. Relationships between and within communities to build a foundational fabric of building trust. So we're focusing intensely on building these networks, which I'll talk more specifically about in just a little bit. But we also know that we have to shape the environments and platforms where people are having conversations. And that's where a lot of our work countering disinformation and shaping 21st century technology comes in. As a public diplomacy practitioner, I do this work with my colleagues in the cyberspace, in the emerging technology space, in the labor and free internet and free media space. We are all working together to put free media, free internet, and a responsible use of emerging technology on the diplomatic agenda with our colleagues and in our priorities with civil society to know that we cannot do this alone, we have to do it together. Through the Declaration for the Future of the Internet, the Freedom Online Coalition, and other critical efforts, the United States is working with our partners and allies to promote an open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet. Easy, right? We know that we need a rights-respecting digital ecosystem. And in our efforts to prevent and respond to the misuse of digital technologies, we are taking on the rampant disinformation, inhibiting honest communication and meaningful dialogue. In an effort to counter disinformation and empower people with the tools and technology know-how to do it themselves, we are working in coordination with other countries, as well as journalists, NGOs, and others in civil society to build this capacity, like I said. The department's Global Engagement Center lives in our public diplomacy world, and we have people from the Global Engagement Center here with us today. Their work is to identify and expose disinformation and the techniques used by those who are propagating it. They are testing technologies with journalists to validate original content online, and they're supporting the development of innovative programs and technologies to empower people to take on disinformation themselves, including, for example, helping give grants for young people to design online games that help identify and expose disinformation. It sharpens players' abilities to discern disinformation in digital content. We know we have to meet people where they are in terms of the platforms and ways that they're communicating with people, and we are endeavoring to do that. We are also continuing to partner with the Digital Communications Network. This is our flagship counter-disinformation network building program. We started in Europe after the 2014 invasion of Crimea by Russia at that point. We now have a digital communications network in Eastern Europe, across Africa, and this fall we'll have one in Latin America. This is a program where we in the US government sponsor people to go through training and programs and empowerment to become responsible voices on digital platforms themselves. We're lifting up civil society leaders and others who are trusted voices in their own community to understand how to talk about values and priorities and democratic progress. We have over 8,000 digital users right now, and like I said, when we expand to Latin America, we'll have quite a few more. On the ground, it's also important to note that those embassies I spoke about, where we have teams of public diplomacy officers, they are finding creative ways to empower youth to fight disinformation as well, partnering with think tanks, endeavoring to translate things into local language, knowing that we don't have the luxury of English speakers everywhere, although we're certainly trying to increase English language access to communities that want it. And we're empowering governments to respond to censorship, disinformation, and more, particularly those governments that are struggling democracies or building their democratic strengths. But to go back to the networks I talked about before, and this is our bread and butter of our work, the heart of trust, we think, is relationships, and we must focus on forging deeper connections and tighter networks with our partners, and in investing in community leaders and young people who will shape the future. As just one example, relevant to many home countries of some of the journalists here today, we know that the majority of the population in Southeast Asia are under the age of 35. And so one of our flagship programs in the US government is called the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI. Through YSEALI, we are engaged in a multi-year effort to harness the extraordinary potential of youth in the region. We are empowering them through exchanges and training and programming with each other, both digitally and in person, to address critical challenges in their own countries, the issues that they find meaningful and that they want to tackle. And we're hoping to expand opportunities for generations to come. In fact, we just doubled the YSEALI program from the United States government at our recent ASEAN Leaders Summit. It was one of our chief deliverables to be able to say that not only are we investing in the security equities and the economic equities in ASEAN, but we are also deeply investing in the young people and the leaders of the future, because we know that that will be the backbone of trust and advancing democratic principles. We also have a Young Pacific Leaders Program, which is another youth-focused initiative with youth from across the Pacific Islands, Australia, and New Zealand. I am having lunch with some of them today, and I am very excited to hear from them how they are benefiting from our programs, what challenges they are seeing in their communities, and how can we as a government partner with them and enable with them to go be the change that they need to see. We are giving grants to them to tackle education, environment, resource management, civic leadership, economic, and social development. One project, just to give you a sense, the Tongan Youth Media Camp facilitated a 4-day retreat for hands-on media training and discussion and analysis of current events. The retreat focused on skill building and video production, leadership communications, and media advocacy. We know that not only do we need to equip journalists and citizen journalists with empowerment to talk about issues they care about and to do investigative journalism, but also to give them technical skills and also to give them resilience tools against, as we've talked about, increasing oppression of free expression and civil rights. Speaking of media advocacy, this is where I want to end. Media advocacy and supporting the Fourth Estate in terms of empowering journalists, fighting for internet freedom, and fighting for media freedom is a bedrock in fostering truth. We know this. We have to protect and uplift a free press. In fact, Secretary Blinken sat down with Maria Ressa last month for RightsCon, which some of you may be familiar with, in partnership with the Atlantic Council as well. And they discussed views on protecting human rights online and advancing democratic progress through media freedom. Central to that discussion was issues such as defending a free press, protecting journalists, and bolstering our work with allies and partners to push back on digital authoritarianism. As Secretary Blinken said in that conversation, quote, "We all have to be seized with the fierce urgency of now." He remarked that civil society, NGOs, the private sector, and independent media must work together, along with governments, to ensure that our shared technology-enabled future advances human freedom and dignity, rather than constraining and rolling back hard-earned democratic progress. I know how important a free press is to a transparent, functioning institution, and that strengthening trust at all levels can only be accomplished through a free and truthful press. A healthy Fourth Estate depends on talent and unrelenting commitment, but it also requires attention and resources. We know this. We are resourcing media around the world as the US government. We are lifting up outlets that need assistance to keep going in oppressive environments. The president is prioritizing this, and we at the State Department are meeting the challenge. Just 2 weeks ago, at the G7 Media Ministers meeting in Bonn, Germany, G7 governments reaffirmed our commitment to a free and open media environment, open, free, global, interoperable, reliable, and secure internet, and resilient telecommunication services. We are united in our opposition to government-imposed internet shutdowns and other restrictions, support for journalists and media professionals, and commitment to promoting access to independent media, especially in regions hit hard by war and crisis, which we know is the case throughout the Indo-Pacific. The State Department is promoting and protecting open and resilient information ecosystems by addressing the needs of at-risk journalists. We have made a number of commitments to advance media freedom and the protection of journalists, and I will spare you the laundry list of things, but I do want to highlight just a few that we think are critically important to protecting the press going forward. The first is our commitment to up to $3.5 million for the launch of a journalism protection platform. This provides at-risk journalists with digital and physical security training, psychosocial care, legal aid, and forms of assistance. And I point this out because note that it is not editorial training, it is not enabling investigative journalism, all of which is important. It is giving the emotional, physical, and security needs of journalists across the world their due attention, knowing that it is harder than ever to be a journalist in most places in this world and to operate freely. We are also bolstering our engagement with the Media Freedom Coalition, which is a multilateral partnership to advance media freedom and the safety of journalists worldwide. And finally, we are supporting our partners at USAID to establish the International Fund for Public Interest Media to enhance the independence, development, and sustainability of independent media globally. As Secretary Blinken noted in his remarks to journalists at the Foreign Press Center in Washington, D.C. in May, on World Press Freedom Day, he said, "A vibrant, independent press is a cornerstone for any healthy democracy." And that is the North Star which we design our programs, which we try to empower communities, and it's the core to the idea that information is a public good, crucial to everything we do and to every decision that we make. It's also integral to our support of and pursuit of the transparency and truth that we've all been discussing this week. So just to say, and then we'll take a few questions, we're at a critical moment that demands we take stock of the changing media landscape, engage in a dispassionate assessment of what's working and what's not working, and acknowledge our roles in collective successes and failures. Trust is earned, we know this. And it starts with honesty and humility from where we sit. Government depends on civil society leaders, public activists, and committed journalists like many of you to hold your institutions and governments accountable, and we welcome that. We in the United States government are committed to safeguarding the truth, and we are ready, must be ready, and willing to meet your collective challenge by prioritizing truth, defending truth tellers, and providing clear, credible information to the people we represent and to people around the world. So I look forward to taking a couple questions and having a more lively discussion. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
We opened, as you mentioned, with a Nobel Peace Prize laureate,
Yes.
And we're finishing with you, so no pressure.
Here we are.
You had some very encouraging remarks in your speech about boosting funding, for media freedom programs, media training, the incredible Waisili program for Southeast Asia, and I'm sure everyone welcomes that. I want to tell you that during the panels we've had here, you touched on some things, as you mentioned. There were a number of issues that came up, but one thing that really struck me as somebody who's been in and out of the region for more decades than I want to acknowledge, is there's a perception that in the last few decades, especially in the South Pacific vis-a-vis the North Pacific, where the United States has strong geostrategic interests, there's compact free association, there's American territory, Guam, Hawaiʻi, etc., that the United States, to a great degree, has been missing in action. And they talked about not only the United States and Australia, which had traditionally been in the region as well, missing, and that void being filled by China. And the number of students that go off to China to study, and someone said in their country 30% of the bureaucrats now speak fluent Mandarin. And they want the United States back. So, first of all, you were in the Obama administration. You obviously were not in the previous administration. You're back in the Biden administration. What happened from your perception, and what can and should this administration be doing to put the United States back in the game in the region?
Well, thanks, Steve, for the question. And I also want to pay tribute to Steve's long, illustrious career of being a journalist in many difficult places, including Washington, D.C., where it is not always easy to be a journalist indeed. Point very well taken on the South Pacific, particularly in the Pacific Islands. And to your point about where did America go, I think I can say conclusively America is coming back there. Focusing on the Pacific Islands in particular is something we are talking a lot about right now in the halls of the State Department. It is a priority for us. We know that the Pacific Islands have been a very contested theater of competition and influence, and that China has done a lot. And that we know that we need to surge in resources, including economic and security, but frankly, a lot of what I think about is resources to these community leaders and these young people I talked about, right? So the Young Pacific Leaders Program I talked about specifically brings together youth from the South Pacific, including, as I mentioned, Australia and New Zealand. And I think that's been a really important program that's just recently got off the ground because, to your point, we are doing a lot in the North Pacific. We are doing a lot even in Southeast Asia, but we need to be doing more in the South Pacific. And so we are critically focused on that. I will say that from where I sit, we just put together our FY24 budget requests, a bureaucratic exercise if there ever was one. But actually, a budget exercise is really an opportunity to reflect what your strategic priorities are. And in our budget request, we are meaningfully asking for increasing resources in the South Pacific, and particularly in the Pacific Islands when it comes to countering disinformation. We need to have people on the ground to counter disinformation. We need to be enabling a free press. We know that the PRC has made gains, particularly in buying media and exercising exclusivity contracts with PRC media in those islands, and that we are at a disadvantage right now as the United States that we are certainly looking to make up. So from a public diplomacy programmatic standpoint, this is absolutely a priority of ours. It's something that yesterday, while I was at INDOPACOM, had a chance to talk to the INDOPACOM commander about, Admiral Aquilino. Our interests are aligned. I know that my Department of Defense colleagues are thinking a lot about our security footprint in the South Pacific. I know that my colleagues at the Department of Commerce and at the Department of State are thinking about what are we doing from an economic standpoint. We just announced the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But from where I sit, what we can do is surge resources particularly into a free media, particularly into countering disinformation, and particularly into enabling young people to be working with each other to tackle these challenges. And I would also just say, Steve, because you asked sort of about the trajectory of this administration's policy, we recently had a high-level delegation of US government officials, including Kurt Campbell, and Assistant Secretary of State Dan Crittenbrink, who actually went to the Solomon Islands, who we are increasing our engagement there. We have announced that we are doing a high-level strategic dialogue with the Solomon Islands. And Secretary Blinken was able to announce earlier this year that the United States is going to open diplomatic facilities in the Solomon Islands when he actually visited Fiji for the first time as a Secretary of State in decades. So you are seeing our footprint ramp up. We know this is a strategic priority. And I'm very proud to say that at least from the resources and the budget that I am focused on, we are surging resources into this space.
Thank you. Liz has agreed to stick around, take a few questions. We have a limited amount of time. Also, if we do get a question from online, I'd love to get a question from someone online as well. We'll call on a couple of folks here in the audience as well. Please, since we have very limited time, no speeches, statements. Be journalists, ask a good, sharp, concise question. And I see somebody right at the mic there. And please introduce yourself. It's hard for me to see, but go for it.
My name is Mark Sheldon. I'm a retired academic teaching in Hong Kong for 41 years. Great. I was earlier in my career director of the Fulbright Commission in Hong Kong. It's called the Hong Kong America Center, now closed. My question is sort of the elephant in the room about engagement with China. Mm-hmm. Notwithstanding Kurt Campbell's assessment of U.S.-China relations, I have to say that decoupling will never work. So my question to you is, how does the U.S. government plan to re-engage with China? We know the loathsome human rights record. We know the repression in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, but the academics in China, the students in China, the Chinese population does not like that particular way of dealing with U.S.-China and people-to-people relations. So my question very specifically is, when will you reestablish the Fulbright program in China and Hong Kong? And how do you plan to have programs that include our Chinese academic and student colleagues? This conference is remarkably empty of colleagues from China. So this question, in a way, is directed at Susie as well. How will the East-West Center in the future re-engage with China? Decoupling in the long term will not work.
Okay.
Mark, thank you, and thank you for your service on the Fulbright Commission. I know I mentioned the Fulbright in my remarks. We are deeply proud of the program. So let me just say a couple things. The spoiler alert answer to the very sharp, specific question on when are we restarting the Fulbright program in China and Hong Kong is stay tuned. It is absolutely something we are actively assessing and working on. There are some bureaucratic reasons why it's not something that I can just make a decision and flip a switch on, but know that amongst our colleagues at the State Department and with the White House, it is something that we are actively talking about. So more to come, but it is absolutely on the radar. I would just, can I really quickly, Steve, you're good. You're like, we're gonna get 8 more questions in 5 minutes.
Well, 1 or 2.
Maybe 1 or 2. Let me just say very quickly, because I think it's critically important. I'm actually really glad that Mark raised this and framed it, because we actually, as a U.S. administration, we just recently laid out a very comprehensive, long deliberated strategy on our approach to the People's Republic of China. And one of the most important things in the strategy and what we are saying and doing is the fact that we recognize that the PRC government is a much different entity and doesn't represent many people in China. And so our strategy and our approach and our resource investments reflect that. We welcome Chinese students to the United States. That is, we are a better country in the United States for that. We know that there's a demand for that, both for students to come from China and practitioners and academics and experts to come from China to the United States, and vice versa. We don't have a choice but to work together in areas where we can identify cooperative solutions. And so we absolutely do have exchange programs that teach English language to Chinese participants. We are sending US students to China regularly on a variety of programs, both to study, to learn Mandarin, and to exchange cultural ideas, because the future does not look as if we're going to be bifurcated, to your point, and we certainly don't want that. And so particularly in the public diplomacy space, there are a lot of areas of cooperation and exchange that we're going to continue.
Thank you. Second in line, I believe, was the gentleman over on this side over here.
Thank you. I'm Shafiq Rahman.
Hi.
I teach in South Carolina now. In 1978, 79, I was with the East-West Center as an intern in Communication Institute. My concern, my question to you is the source credibility and reliability that you mentioned. We never heard the word, false news or alternate facts or things in 1960s, 70s, 80s. Mm-hmm. It has become really a major point now. Mm-hmm. Is there a real qualitative change in journalism? We have a lot of reporters, editors in here. It's a question for all of us to really look at it, how to deal with it. Is it the technology? Mm-hmm. Is it the media owners are controlling? Is it the professional journalists that we are really facing major issues? Or the failure of the journalism, failure of the media that
Okay, I'm going to
information
cut to the chase here. The
we could do a
question
whole
is,
honor just a
who's
whole
to
hour
blame?
on that.
Yeah, the message is taking over the media.
We've got to move on.
Yes.
Questions, not statements. So
Thank you, and nice to meet you. My sister lives in South Carolina, a lovely place to live. So I think instead of casting blame, I'll just share quickly how we think about tackling the problem about disinformation. Because to your point, what we've seen, particularly with the disaggregation of media and the profit incentives in media, the profit incentive is for eyeballs, and we have seen that some media outlets have used the weaponization of truth and information unto their profit motive, right? That's all I'm going to say about that, but we know that that's happening in the background. You know, what's so interesting is when I go around talking about disinformation, or when people want to talk to me about disinformation, it's often talked about as just a messaging challenge. Oh, if we just counter the falsehood with the truth, people will believe us. That is not it. That is naive, it is not sustainable, and you cannot stop propaganda machines that are going to be propaganda machines, so we have to decide where best to invest resources to chip away at it. So I'll just offer quickly, our intrepid timekeeper is keeping us on time here. I'll offer quickly that when we think about disinformation, I'd encourage everyone to think about it as sort of a 360 ecosystem approach. You have a messaging component where there are certainly going to be narratives and issues and stories that are worth refuting directly. In fact, from the State Department, part of what we've done more sharply than ever during the Russia-Ukraine conflict is very clearly on our own attributed platforms lay out truth versus lie, fact versus fiction. Putin says this is the truth. And we do have to do a fair amount of counter-narrative, particularly when there are high stakes. But it's not just a messaging exercise, right? As we all know. It is also a media freedom exercise. To your point about whether, like, what role the media has to play, my judgment is that the media cannot, should not, and will not fix any of these problems alone, but they have a role to play, right? On my way out to Hawaii, my colleague and I stopped in Los Angeles, and we met with the dean of the Annenberg School of Communications, and we had a really interesting discussion exactly about this topic.
USC.
Yes, USC. How are we training the next generation of journalists to be able to decipher and push back against disinformation without they themselves needing to bear the responsibility of being the arbiters of ultimate truth, which is ultimately probably not sustainable for most journalists and media outlets. But of course, media have a role to play. Then, of course, we have the underpinning technology, right? And this is where we get into a free internet, an open, free internet, not a splintered one, and one in which content moderation decisions and internet freedom decisions are made thinking about how does information travel. And I will say that myself directly and members of my team are in regular discussions with social media companies and digital platforms on exactly these issues. You know, they are dealing with internet across the world that in some regions and in some countries, some of which you cover, the internet is being splintered or oppressed. And in other places, it's vibrant and free democracies. And so I am sympathetic with the challenges of precedent and universal challenge around internet freedom. There's a lot more to say. The last thing I'll just say very quickly, Steve, you're doing a great job, is I really just want to emphasize that when it comes to combating disinformation, we also have to play the long game. And that's why I spoke so much about network building and bolstering community leaders and young people, because combating disinformation is not just a rapid response exercise. It is a long-term structural challenge that we need to invest in people's media literacy, digital literacy, and making sure that we are enabling credible voices in communities. I joked before about the dentist and the weatherman, but I think we all know there's some truth in that, right? And so how are community leaders and civil society leaders being trained and being resourced to be arbiters of truth in their own communities? We think a lot about that long-term challenge.
We are now in overtime, but you were kind enough to stick around for a last question.
Sure.
So if you can make your question very brief, sir, at the microphone.
Thank you, sir. My name is Mushtaq Sarki from Pakistan as a senior journalist and social activist. Not my statement, but question. I am having this opportunity. There are two parts of my question. One is a former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, have been removed from the seat after successful vote of no confidence in the parliament. Why he is still blaming US for his downfall? The other one, fuel prices and inflation rate is very high in Pakistan. When common people asking government through media channels, they are blaming IMF. So why IMF not releasing amount and funds for Pakistan? Is there any conspiracy behind the CPEC and China's support?
Also, we could spend an hour on that too.
Well, if you want to make, I don't know whether the Undersecretary can really address something about the IMF and a conspiracy in Pakistan, but if maybe you can use this opportunity to talk about that has been another relationship that's been contentious over the years between U.S. and Pakistan. Any sort of engagement with South Asia, and also what was mentioned quite extensively during this conference were the challenges to the media in India, and journalists being thrown in jail, and some perception, a more general question, that the U.S. is tamping down its messaging about human rights and these sort of violations out of geostrategic priorities. So how would, whether it's Pakistan or India or elsewhere, how would you respond to that?
Thanks for that question, and thank you, sir, for what you raised as well. I think that's exactly right, that we know that this is a challenge, particularly in South Asia, and we are watching this area of the world quite closely in terms of internet freedom and media freedom being oppressed. We know, and what underpins our engagement with these governments is that any democratic society is the better off for increased freedom of expression and increased transparency and accountability between government and citizens, and that is what underpins our discussions with them. One point I think is important to make in the framing of this issue is that besides our messaging and talking about the fact that these are our values, this is part of our diplomatic agenda. So our US government officials are in touch with senior government officials, both in India and Pakistan, about these issues. We cannot just talk about them. We have to press them in private settings as well. We are doing that. And we enjoy a very robust strategic partnership, both with India and with Pakistan, but we also make sure that we are talking about our values behind those closed doors as well, including on internet freedom and media freedom.
Well, as you know, we journalists don't like to just rely on the public statements and really want to know what is going on behind closed doors, and it's our job to sort of ferret that out.
Exactly.
So thank you very much, Undersecretary Allen, for coming
Pleasure
here
to be
today.
here.
Big round of applause. And it's been very enlightening. Best of luck. And I hope you get to individually visit the countries from those of us who are here today. Thank you very much.
You too.
Mahalo.
Thanks, everybody.